The moment Nathaniel Montgomery finished signing the corporate transfer papers, his hand cramped from the pressure he'd applied, as if pressing harder might somehow reverse the reality of what he was doing. Across the conference table, the woman he'd divorced just 8 weeks ago, the woman he'd kicked out of his home on a rainy March night, while his mother Eleanor stood behind him, laughing at her tears, now controlled every asset his grandfather had spent 50 years building. Victoria's transformation was complete. Gone was the quiet, modestly dressed wife who'd shopped at outlet malls and cooked dinner every night. In her place sat a woman in custom Italian tailoring, her dark hair styled by professionals, her pregnancy evident but dignified beneath expertly tailored fabric. But the most striking change wasn't her appearance. It was the cold certainty in her eyes, the eyes of someone who'd been underestimated their entire life and had finally stopped pretending to be small. Amber, Nathaniel's new wife of 6 weeks, sat beside him, scrolling through Instagram, completely unaware that the woman she'd replaced had just become her husband's employer, landlord, and the ultimate authority over their entire future. Eleanor Montgomery, the architect of Victoria's humiliation, was absent from this meeting, still believing her son had simply divorced an unsuitable wife and upgraded to someone worthy of their family name. None of them had known Victoria's real identity, the sole heir to the Chen fortune, hidden after her billionaire parents' murder, raised in protective anonymity by trustees who'd invested her inheritance into a $1 trillion empire. The consulting job where she'd worked during their marriage hadn't been a career. It had been her cover, a way to live normally while her wealth compounded, in trusts she couldn't access until her 28th birthday, which had occurred 3 weeks after Nathaniel kicked her out. When the lawyer had called to inform her that her fortune was now fully in her control, Victoria had made one phone call to the investment firm that held the Montgomery Company's debt. 6 strategic moves later, she owned everything the family had believed was theirs. Now Nathaniel's tears fell onto the papers, his regret so visceral it filled the room with suffocating weight. But what haunted Victoria as she watched him cry wasn't whether he deserved her forgiveness. It was whether the child growing inside her deserved a father who'd only wanted them after losing everything else. Dear viewers, this powerful story reveals how cruel judgments based on appearance can devastate lives and destroy legacies. You'll discover why treating everyone with dignity matters, how toxic family influence ruins relationships, and why true strength often hides in those we underestimate. Watch as Victoria transforms from victim to victor, teaching us that mercy can coexist with justice. Drop in the comments what lessons you learned and what you would have done differently if you were in Victoria's shoes. Subscribe now for more captivating, educational stories that entertain while teaching life-changing lessons about respect, resilience, and redemption. 8 weeks earlier, Victoria had stood in the master bedroom of the Montgomery estate, folding her worn cotton nightgown into a suitcase that had cost her $12 at a discount store, while Nathaniel paced behind her with the agitation of a man who'd rehearsed this moment, but couldn't quite deliver his lines convincingly. The March rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the manicured grounds where they'd been married 3 years ago, back when his promises had seemed as permanent as the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. But tonight, those same windows reflected a different scene. A husband who wouldn't meet his wife's eyes, a marriage crumbling under the weight of outside interference, and a woman who'd spent 6 weeks hiding morning sickness so expertly that no one, not even the man who slept beside her, had noticed the life growing inside her body. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying that peculiar tone of someone who believes they're being reasonable while doing something unconscionable. His tailored shirt was wrinkled from where Amber had grabbed it earlier that evening when she'd kissed him in the foyer, not caring that his wife might see, perhaps even hoping she would. But what wounded Victoria most wasn't the affair itself. It was how eagerly his mother had facilitated it, how Eleanor had positioned Amber in Nathaniel's path, like a hunter setting bait, then stepped back to watch her son take what she'd offered. Victoria paused mid-fold, her hands gripping a sweater Nathaniel had given her last Christmas, back when he'd still looked at her with something resembling affection rather than the distant politeness of someone mentally already gone. "You told me you loved me 3 months ago," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to break through her composure. "You said your mother's opinions didn't matter, that we were building our own life." But even as she spoke, she knew the truth. Eleanor's opinions had always mattered more than Victoria's presence. Her approval had always outweighed any vows Nathaniel had spoken. "People change," he replied, and the ease with which he dismissed 3 years of shared life made something inside Victoria go cold and still. "Amber and I have more in common. She understands my world, the galas, the social expectations, the business connections." He spoke as if love was a networking opportunity, as if marriage was merely another transaction to be optimized for maximum social return. But the most cutting part was that he actually believed this, believed Amber's Instagram popularity and society connections made her superior to the woman who'd supported him through his father's death, who'd held him during anxiety attacks about taking over the company, who'd loved him when he was too afraid to make decisions his mother might disapprove of. The bedroom door opened without a knock, and Eleanor Montgomery entered as if she owned not just the house, but the very air within it. Her silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, her expression carrying that particular satisfaction of someone witnessing a plan coming together exactly as designed. "Still here?" she asked Victoria with theatrical surprise, as if she hadn't orchestrated this entire evening, hadn't called Nathaniel into her study that afternoon to remind him, again, that he could do better, that Victoria's lack of family connections was holding him back, that Amber's father's media company could open doors the Montgomery family needed opened. "I'm gathering my things," Victoria said, maintaining the dignity that had always seemed to irritate her mother-in-law, the quiet strength that Eleanor had consistently mistaken for weakness. But Eleanor had never bothered to learn where that strength came from, had never asked about Victoria's past or why an orphaned 24-year-old had seemed so unbothered by the Montgomery family's wealth, so unimpressed by their social standing. "Don't take too long," Eleanor said, glancing at the Cartier watch on her wrist with deliberate emphasis. "Amber's downstairs waiting, and it would be awkward if you were still here when Nathaniel goes back down." The cruelty was casual, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for their actions, who'd spent 63 years believing their wealth insulated them from the normal rules of human decency. Victoria closed her suitcase with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than Eleanor's words, then looked at Nathaniel one final time, searching his face for any sign of the man she'd married, the one who'd promised to protect her from exactly this kind of treatment. But that man was gone, replaced by this hollow version who stood silent while his mother dismantled his marriage like it was furniture to be rearranged. "I'm pregnant," Victoria said, the words emerging before she'd consciously decided to speak them, before she'd calculated whether revealing this information would change anything or simply add another weapon to Eleanor's arsenal. The room went silent except for the rain, which had intensified into a downpour that matched the storm breaking inside Victoria's chest. Nathaniel's face flickered through several expressions: shock, confusion, something that might have been hope, before settling into the distant politeness he'd worn all evening. But it was Eleanor's reaction that told Victoria everything she needed to know about her future in this house, in this family, in this marriage that had just been revealed as the fragile illusion it always was. Eleanor laughed, not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable one, but genuine amusement, the sound sharp and cutting as broken glass. "Oh, how convenient," she said, her eyes narrowing with suspicion that revealed exactly what she thought. That Victoria was lying, manipulating, desperately inventing reasons why Nathaniel shouldn't leave her. A pregnancy announced the exact moment you're being asked to leave. How very predictable. The accusation hung in the air like poison, transforming Victoria's truth into something sordid, something calculating. "Mother," Nathaniel began, but Eleanor cut him off with a raised hand, her attention fixed on Victoria with the intensity of a prosecutor who'd just caught a witness in an obvious lie. "I suppose next you'll want a doctor's confirmation, time to prove this convenient condition, maybe a few more months living here while you figure out your next move?" Eleanor's voice dripped with contempt, each word carefully chosen to wound. "I've seen this tactic before, dear. Women who think a baby will trap a man into staying in a marriage that's already over." But what Eleanor couldn't see, what her arrogance had blinded her to, was that Victoria wasn't trying to trap anyone, wasn't begging to stay in a family that had never wanted her. Victoria lifted her suitcase, the weight of it nothing compared to the weight of what she was leaving behind, and walked toward the door with the quiet dignity that had always been her signature. But Nathaniel stepped into her path, his face conflicted, torn between his mother's expectations and some fading sense of responsibility. "If you're really pregnant," he said, his doubt evident in the way he emphasized "really," "then we should talk about this properly. Maybe wait a few days before you go." "Move," Victoria said softly, and something in her voice, some finality that hadn't been there before, made him step aside despite his mother's sharp intake of breath. But Victoria had barely reached the top of the grand staircase when Eleanor's hand gripped her arm, fingers digging in with surprising strength for a woman her age. "You're not taking anything from this house that you didn't bring with you," Eleanor hissed, her mask of society propriety dropping to reveal the cruelty beneath. "That suitcase probably contains items we purchased, clothes my son bought you, things that belong to this family." But before Victoria could respond, before she could point out that everything she owned had been bought with her own salary from the consulting job Eleanor had always dismissed as playing at work, Eleanor's other hand reached for the suitcase. The struggle was brief and ugly. Two women pulling at opposite ends of a cheap suitcase on a marble staircase while rain hammered the windows and Nathaniel stood frozen in the bedroom doorway, unable or unwilling to intervene. But then Eleanor's grip shifted, her hand moving from the suitcase to Victoria's shoulder, and she pushed, not violently but firmly enough that Victoria stumbled backward, her foot missing the top step. Time crystallized into brutal clarity, Victoria's hand instinctively moving to protect her stomach, her body twisting to avoid falling directly on her abdomen, the suitcase tumbling down ahead of her as she grabbed the banister to stop her fall. She caught herself after 3 steps, her heart hammering, her breath coming in sharp gasps, but the damage was done, not to her body, but to any remaining illusion that this family deserved her loyalty or her silence. "Get out," Eleanor said from the top of the stairs, her chest heaving, her perfect composure cracked just enough to show the rage beneath. "Get out of this house right now." But Victoria was already moving, already descending the stairs with her ruined suitcase, already walking toward the front door that Amber helpfully opened with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The rain hit Victoria like a physical wall the moment she stepped outside, soaking through her thin sweater in seconds, plastering her hair to her face, but she didn't stop walking until she reached the end of the driveway, where the street lamps cast orange pools of light onto wet pavement. Only then did she turn back to see Eleanor and Nathaniel silhouetted in the lit doorway, his arm around his mother's shoulders in comfort, neither of them making any move to call her back, to apologize, to acknowledge what had just happened. Victoria's hand rested on her stomach, protecting the secret that only she knew the full truth of. Not just that she was pregnant, but that in 3 weeks, she would turn 28 and inherit a fortune that would make the Montgomery family's wealth look like pocket change. The rain washed away her tears, but it couldn't wash away the memory of Eleanor's laughter, Nathaniel's doubt, or the moment she'd realized that the family she'd married into had never seen her as anything more than a temporary inconvenience in their carefully curated lives. But what none of them knew, what Victoria had protected for 3 years of marriage, was that she'd never needed their money, their name, or their approval. She'd only ever wanted the one thing they'd proven themselves incapable of giving: genuine love without conditions, without calculations, without the constant assessment of whether she was worthy enough to keep. That night, standing in the rain outside the Montgomery estate, Victoria made a decision that would reshape everything. She wouldn't beg, wouldn't plead, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken, but she also wouldn't forget, not Eleanor's cruelty, not Nathaniel's weakness, not the sound of that laughter as she'd been pushed out into the storm. And when the time came, when her inheritance unlocked and her true identity emerged from the protective anonymity her trustees had maintained, she would show them exactly who they'd underestimated. The rain continued to fall as Victoria walked away from the only home she'd known for 3 years, carrying a child whose father had already chosen someone else, heading toward a future these people couldn't imagine. Behind her, the Montgomery mansion blazed with light and warmth she was no longer welcome to share. But ahead of her, invisible in the darkness and rain, waited a destiny far more powerful than anything Eleanor Montgomery could have planned or Nathaniel could have provided. Justice, Victoria thought as she disappeared into the storm, sometimes requires patience, and she had nothing but time. 21 days after the rain-soaked exile, Victoria sat in a mahogany-paneled office 70 floors above Manhattan, listening to 3 men in $1,000 suits explain that she was now one of the wealthiest individuals in North America, but the numbers they cited felt abstract and distant compared to the very real nausea churning in her stomach. Her 28th birthday had passed quietly in the modest hotel room she'd been living in since leaving the Montgomery estate, marked only by a text message from her trustee, requesting this meeting and a morning spent hunched over the toilet, experiencing the full force of first trimester morning sickness that she could no longer hide from anyone, though there was no longer anyone close enough to notice. But what the trustees were explaining now, the scope of the Chen fortune, the strategic investments made over 15 years, the corporate holdings that spanned 17 countries, required her to think beyond her immediate survival and confront the reality of who she'd always been, beneath the disguise of normalcy she'd worn like armor. "Your parents established the trust structure before their deaths," explained Richard Hawthorne, the senior trustee who'd monitored her life from a careful distance since she was 13 years old, his silver hair and grandfather demeanor making him seem more like family than the paid guardian he actually was. The pharmaceutical patents alone generate approximately $4.2 billion annually, but that's just one division of Chen Holdings. He slid a leather portfolio across the conference table, its weight substantial, its contents representing a destiny Victoria had known was coming but had never quite believed would arrive. But the strangest part wasn't learning she was wealthy. She'd always known that theoretically. It was realizing that for 3 years she'd lived with people who'd judged her worthless while she'd been sitting on a fortune that could have purchased their family company 100 times over. Victoria opened the portfolio with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the strange cognitive dissonance of seeing her name. Victoria Chen, not Victoria Montgomery, never truly Victoria Montgomery, listed as controlling shareholder of entities she'd never heard of but which apparently shaped global markets. "Why didn't you tell me specifics before now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. her mind already calculating possibilities that 3 weeks ago would have seemed like fantasy. But Richard's expression shifted into something apologetic, something that suggested the answer was more complicated than simple trust administration. "Your parents were murdered because someone discovered their wealth," he said quietly, and the bluntness of it landed like a physical blow, even though Victoria had always known this truth in abstract terms. They'd built their fortune, quietly, invested through shell companies and offshore trusts, but someone traced the pharmaceutical patents back to them. He paused, his fingers steepled in that way lawyers do when they're about to deliver difficult information that can't be softened. "We found you in your bedroom closet, 13 years old, alive only because you'd been hiding there, reading with headphones on when the assassins came through the house." But the detail that made Victoria's breath catch wasn't the reminder of that night. She'd spent 15 years in therapy processing the trauma. It was what Richard said next. "We placed you in witness protection protocols not because there was an active threat, but because we couldn't risk anyone connecting the orphaned Victoria Chen to the $1 trillion empire she'd inherited," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of decisions made when she'd been too young to have input. "We created a new background for you, mediocre, private schools, a modest consulting job, a life designed to be unremarkable enough that no one would look deeper. But that careful construction of normalcy had worked too well, had been so convincing that even Victoria had sometimes forgotten it was a disguise, had actually believed she was the person she'd been pretending to be. The trust required you to maintain that cover until your 28th birthday, at which point you'd be old enough to manage the attention that would come with your real identity, experienced enough to handle the responsibility of the fortune." Victoria's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, to the small curve that was just beginning to show beneath her loose sweater, and she thought about the child growing there who would inherit all of this complexity, this wealth, this legacy of violence and protection. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer, already felt the shift happening inside her, from the woman who'd accepted Eleanor's cruelty to someone capable of responding with equal force. But Richard's next words confirmed what she'd been planning in the quiet privacy of her hotel room, what had sustained her through the loneliest 3 weeks of her life. "Now you decide who you want to be," Richard said, sliding another document across the table, this one a detailed financial report on Montgomery Enterprises, complete with debt structures, loan agreements, and vulnerability assessments that her investment team had apparently been compiling without her knowledge. "We've been monitoring your situation, Victoria. We know about the divorce, about how they treated you, about your pregnancy." His voice carried a grandfatherly warmth that made her eyes burn with unshed tears, the first real kindness anyone had shown her since that rainy night. But it was the younger trustee, David Park, who spoke next with an edge of strategic calculation that reminded Victoria these men weren't just guardians. They were sharks who'd been circling the Montgomery family's weakness for weeks. "Montgomery Enterprises is over-leveraged," David said, flipping open his own portfolio to reveal financial projections that painted a picture of a company teetering on the edge of serious trouble, held together by reputation and legacy rather than sound business practices. They took on significant debt 2 years ago to expand into the pharmaceutical distribution sector, ironically, a market your family's patents dominate. The irony wasn't lost on Ibion. Victoria, Nathaniel's company, was indirectly paying royalties to her fortune without anyone realizing the connection. Their primary lender is Westchester Capital, which is a subsidiary of Chen Holdings, which means... But Victoria finished his sentence before he could, her mind already several steps ahead, already seeing the elegant symmetry of what was possible. "Which means I own their debt," she said softly, and the words tasted like power and vindication and something darker that she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but couldn't deny. I could call the loans, force restructuring, or offer to buy them out entirely. But even as she spoke, she thought about Nathaniel's face in those last moments. The doubt when she'd told him about the pregnancy, the ease with which he'd chosen Amber's superficial appeal over 3 years of genuine partnership. The memory stung less now than it had 3 weeks ago, replaced by something colder, something that felt more like justice than revenge. Richard nodded slowly, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that suggested he'd anticipated exactly this trajectory of thought. "You could do all of those things," he agreed, "but I should remind you that your parents built their fortune through ethical business practices, through innovation and value creation, rather than hostile acquisitions." It was a gentle warning, a reminder of legacy and responsibility, but Victoria heard the underlying message. Whatever she chose to do next would define not just her relationship with the Montgomery family, but her own character going forward. "My parents were murdered in their own home," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that surprised even her. "They played by the rules, stayed ethical, and it didn't protect them or me." But the moment the words left her mouth, she felt the unfairness of them, the false equivalency between her parents' tragedy and her own situation. Eleanor Montgomery was cruel and classist, but she wasn't a murderer. Nathaniel was weak and easily manipulated, but he wasn't a killer. "I'm sorry," she added quickly, seeing Richard's flinch. "That wasn't fair. This situation isn't the same." "No, it's not," Richard agreed, "but your anger is justified even if the comparison isn't." He leaned forward, his expression softening into something more human than professional. "Victoria, in the 15 years I've watched over you, I've seen you handle grief, displacement, and complete identity reconstruction with remarkable grace. But grace doesn't require you to accept mistreatment." It was permission, she realized, to be angry, to take action, to stop being the quiet victim who accepted whatever treatment the world offered. "What matters is what you do with the power you now have access to, whether you use it to destroy or to build something better." The question hung in the air as Victoria looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at Manhattan stretching in all directions, millions of people living their lives unaware that in this room decisions were being made that would reshape at least one family's future. But what she kept coming back to wasn't Eleanor's cruelty or Nathaniel's betrayal. It was the pregnancy, the child who was half Montgomery regardless of how badly that family had treated her, the innocent life that deserved better than to be weaponized in adult conflicts. "I want to buy the company," Victoria said finally, her decision crystallizing even as she spoke the words. "Not to destroy it, but to control it, to ensure my child's legacy from both sides of their family is protected." But there was more to it than just protection, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. She wanted them to know, wanted Eleanor to understand exactly who she'd underestimated, wanted Nathaniel to face the consequences of choosing his mother's approval over his wife's worth. "Can it be done quietly without them knowing it's me until the papers are signed?" David's smile was sharp and approving. "We can structure it through subsidiary corporations, make it look like a standard private equity acquisition until the final transfer documents reveal the ultimate beneficial owner." He was already making notes, his mind clearly racing through the legal structures that would make this possible. "The whole thing could be completed in 6 to 8 weeks if we move aggressively." But Richard's expression was more contemplative, more concerned with implications beyond the immediate satisfaction of turning the tables on people who'd earned their comeuppance. "Before you commit to this path," Richard said carefully, "I want you to consider what happens after. You'll own the company, yes, but you'll also be responsible for 240 employees who had nothing to do with how Eleanor treated you, for clients and contracts and community obligations." It was the question Victoria hadn't fully considered, What came after the satisfaction of winning, after the moment of revelation, after the power dynamics had completely reversed? Can you separate your personal feelings from sound business judgment? Can you work with Nathaniel if he stays on, knowing what he did? Can you face Eleanor knowing she'll hate you even more for proving her wrong? The questions settled over Victoria like heavy blankets, each one requiring serious consideration. But one thing became clear as she sat there in the office that represented her true identity. She was done being small, done accepting mistreatment, done pretending her worth was determined by other people's ability to recognize it. "I don't need Eleanor's approval anymore," Victoria said, her hand resting on her stomach where the future was literally growing. "I don't need Nathaniel's love, and I don't need their family's acceptance." But she needed something else, something she was just beginning to articulate. "I need them to see me, really see me, as the person I've always been, not the diminished version they created in their imaginations." Richard nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Then let's make sure they see you clearly," he said, and in that moment Victoria felt the full weight of her inheritance settle onto her shoulders, not just the money or the power, but the responsibility to use both wisely, to be better than the people who'd wronged her, while still refusing to accept their mistreatment. The meeting continued for another hour, lawyers and financial advisors streaming in and out with documents to sign, structures to approve, decisions that would reshape her entire future. But through it all, Victoria kept coming back to one image, Nathaniel's face when he realized who she really was, the moment when all his assumptions shattered and he understood exactly what his mother's cruelty and his own weakness had cost him. That moment was coming, rushing toward them all with the inevitability of a train that had left the station the night Eleanor had laughed at her tears and pushed her into the rain. Justice, Victoria thought again, sometimes wears expensive suits and works through proper legal channels, and in 6 to 8 weeks, the Montgomery family would learn that the woman they'd discarded like trash had always been the most valuable thing in Nathaniel's life. He'd just been too blind to see it until it was far too late to matter. 6 weeks into his marriage to Amber, Nathaniel sat in his father's old office at Montgomery Enterprises, staring at financial reports that made less sense each time he read them. But the numbers weren't the real problem. The real problem was that he'd started dreaming about Victoria every night, seeing her face in that moment when she'd told him she was pregnant, hearing the rain that had drummed against the windows while his mother laughed. The dreams always ended the same way. Victoria walking away down the driveway, her figure disappearing into darkness while he stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to call her back, unable to do anything except watch her leave. But he'd wake up next to Amber, who slept with her phone charging on the nightstand so she could check her Instagram engagement first thing in the morning. And he'd wonder when exactly his life had become something he didn't recognize anymore. "You're not listening to me," Amber said, from the doorway, her voice carrying that particular edge of someone who'd been ignored and didn't appreciate it. Her designer outfit perfectly coordinated but somehow always looking like a costume rather than clothes. She held her phone up, screen facing him, showing what appeared to be a party invitation or event announcement that he couldn't quite make out from across the room. "Your mother wants us to host the spring gala at the estate, and I need to know the budget so I can hire the right planners." But the casual way she said "the estate" irritated him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It was his family's home, not hers. Not yet. Maybe not ever, despite the marriage certificate that said otherwise. "We need to talk about the company finances first," Nathaniel said, gesturing to the reports spread across his desk like evidence of crimes he didn't remember committing, numbers that showed a disturbing pattern of declining revenue and increasing debt, service that seemed to have accelerated in the past year. "Westchester Capital sent another letter about the loan covenants, and I don't understand why we're suddenly in danger of default when 6 months ago everything seemed fine. But the truth was that 6 months ago he hadn't been paying attention to the finances, had been too distracted by his mother's constant commentary about Victoria's unsuitability and Amber's carefully orchestrated availability at every social function Eleanor had arranged. Amber's expression flickered with something that might have been concern but settled quickly into dismissive boredom. "That's not my problem, babe," she said, already turning back to her phone, her thumbs moving rapidly across the screen in response to some notification that was clearly more important than her husband's business crisis. "Your mother said the company always has these little cash flow issues, and they always work themselves out." But hearing his mother's reassurances filtered through Amber's disinterested delivery made them sound hollow in ways they hadn't when Eleanor had spoken them directly, made him wonder if he'd been accepting comfortable lies instead of confronting uncomfortable truths. The intercom on his desk buzzed, his assistant's voice crackling through with a tension that immediately put Nathaniel on alert. "Mr. Montgomery, there's a Mr. David Park here from Chen Holdings requesting an urgent meeting," she said. And the name meant nothing to him, but the word urgent, combined with a company he'd never heard of, triggered instincts that 3 years of marriage to Victoria had actually sharpened. She'd always been better at reading situations than he was, always noticed details he missed, always asked the questions he hadn't thought to ask. "He says it's regarding the Westchester Capital loan and that you'd want to take this meeting immediately." Nathaniel's stomach dropped, in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee he'd been drinking and everything to do with the sudden certainty that something significant was happening, something that would change the trajectory of his already complicated life. "Send him in," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, and Amber looked up from her phone with actual interest for the first time in the conversation, her influencer instincts apparently detecting drama worth paying attention to. But when David Park entered the office in a suit that probably cost more than the furniture surrounding them, carrying a leather portfolio that screamed expensive legal representation, Nathaniel felt the same sensation he'd experienced the night he'd asked Victoria for a divorce, the feeling of making a terrible mistake, but being too far into the process to stop it. "Mr. Montgomery," David said, his tone professionally courteous, but containing an undertone that suggested he knew things Nathaniel didn't, held cards that hadn't been revealed yet. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice. I'm representing the entity that recently acquired the controlling interest in Westchester Capital, which, as you know, holds the primary debt obligations for Montgomery Enterprises." The words were carefully chosen, each one a piece of a larger puzzle that Nathaniel couldn't quite see the shape of yet, but the phrase, "recently acquired," sent alarm bells ringing through his consciousness because he hadn't been notified of any change in their lender, hadn't received any communication about ownership transfers. "I wasn't aware Westchester had been sold," Nathaniel said carefully, his mind racing through the implications of this development, wondering why their account manager hadn't mentioned such a significant change during their last conversation 3 days ago. "Who's the new owner?" But even as he asked the question, something in David Park's expression, a slight tightening around the eyes, a hint of satisfaction that seemed almost personal, made Nathaniel's pulse quicken with a dread he couldn't quite name. David opened his portfolio with deliberate slowness, extracting a document that he placed on the desk between them, the letterhead showing a corporate logo Nathaniel didn't recognize, but which seemed designed to convey both power and permanence. Chen Holdings is a diversified investment conglomerate with interests in pharmaceuticals, technology, and strategic corporate acquisitions, he explained in the tone of someone reciting facts everyone should already know. "We acquired Westchester Capital as part of a larger portfolio reorganization, and in reviewing the existing loan agreements, we've identified several concerning trends in Montgomery Enterprises' financial performance." But the way he said "concerning trends" made it clear this wasn't a routine check-in. This was something more serious, more threatening. Amber had stopped scrolling through her phone. Nathaniel noticed peripherally, her attention now fully engaged in a way it rarely was during discussions about his actual work. Her expression calculating as she watched David Park with the assessment of someone trying to determine if this situation could be leveraged for content or needed to be avoided for brand protection. "What kind of concerns?" she asked before Nathaniel could. Her voice taking on a sweetness that he'd learned meant she was performing rather than being genuine, trying to charm her way through a situation she didn't fully understand. David's gaze flicked to Amber with barely concealed dismissal before returning to Nathaniel, his professionalism never wavering but his message clear. This conversation was between the actual stakeholders, not social media personalities playing at business. "The concerns are substantial enough that Chen Holdings is exercising its option to accelerate the loan repayment timeline," he said, and the words landed like physical blows, each syllable carrying implications that made Nathaniel's carefully constructed world start to crumble. "You have 90 days to either pay the full outstanding balance of $47 million or negotiate a restructuring that would require significant operational changes, including potential changes in ownership structure." The number seemed impossible, far larger than Nathaniel had realized their debt had grown to, but the real problem was the 90-day timeline. There was no way the company could generate that kind of cash in 3 months, no way to refinance that quickly, no way to avoid the restructuring that would essentially mean losing control of the family business his grandfather had built from nothing. "This is extortion," Nathaniel said, his voice rising despite his attempt to maintain composure, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, hard enough that his knuckles went white. "You can't just arbitrarily accelerate repayment without cause. There are protections in the loan agreement." "There are also covenant violations," David countered smoothly, sliding another document across the desk, this one highlighted with sections that apparently detailed the ways Montgomery Enterprises had failed to meet the terms of their loan agreement. Technical violations that Nathaniel had assumed were minor issues that could be resolved with explanations and amendments. Revenue thresholds missed for 3 consecutive quarters, debt-to-equity ratios exceeding agreed limits, failure to maintain required cash reserves. Each item he listed was accurate, Nathaniel realized with growing horror, each one something he'd been meaning to address but had put off, distracted by his mother's insistence that these were normal fluctuations, by Amber's constant need for attention, by his own guilt about Victoria that he'd been trying to bury under work and social obligations. "My mother handles most of the financial oversight," Nathaniel said, and immediately hated how weak it sounded, how much it revealed about his own inadequacy in managing the business he was supposed to be running. She didn't mention these covenant issues were serious enough to trigger acceleration. But even as he spoke, he wondered what else Eleanor hadn't told him, what other problems she'd minimized or hidden entirely, whether her confidence in the company's stability was based on actual financial analysis or simply her unwillingness to admit that the Montgomery empire was crumbling. David's expression softened slightly, moving from professional adversary to something almost sympathetic, though whether the sympathy was genuine or strategic, Nathaniel couldn't determine. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm not here to destroy your company," he said, his tone shifting to something more collaborative. "Chen Holdings is actually interested in a partnership arrangement that could resolve the debt situation while allowing Montgomery Enterprises to continue operating." But the word partnership in this context meant something very different from equal collaboration. It meant accepting outside control, surrendering the independence his grandfather had valued above almost everything else, admitting that the Montgomery family could no longer manage their own legacy without help. "What kind of partnership?" Nathaniel asked, though part of him already knew the answer. already sensed the trap closing around him with the inexorable logic of mathematics and legal agreements he'd signed without fully understanding their implications. But what choice did he have except to listen, to consider options that weeks ago would have been unthinkable, to face the reality that his decisions, both personal and professional, had led to this moment of reckoning? David pulled out yet another document, this one labeled Preliminary Acquisition Proposal, in bold letters that seemed to mock Nathaniel's loss of control with their bureaucratic precision. Chen Holdings is prepared to acquire a controlling stake in Montgomery Enterprises in exchange for debt forgiveness and a capital infusion that would stabilize operations, he explained, his finger tracing down the terms that would essentially transfer ownership from the Montgomery family to this mysterious conglomerate Nathaniel had never heard of before today. You and your family would retain minority ownership and operational roles, but major strategic decisions would require approval from the new majority stakeholder. But the phrase, operational roles, was a polite way of saying they'd be employees in the company they'd once owned, subject to oversight and approval from people who had no connection to the Montgomery legacy or history. Amber stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that matched the jarring reality of what was happening. "You can't seriously be considering this," she said, her voice carrying genuine alarm for perhaps the first time since they'd gotten married, her Instagram perfect life apparently not including scenarios where her husband lost his family company. What will people think? How will this look? But her concerns were purely superficial, Nathaniel realized. She cared about the social, embarrassment, the loss of status, the way this would play to her followers, not about the actual substance of what was being lost or the historical significance of the Montgomery name being subordinated to outside ownership. "What I think," Nathaniel said slowly, looking at Amber with sudden clarity about who she really was and what their marriage actually meant to her, "is that we don't have a choice." But the words felt like surrender, like the final acknowledgement that every decision he'd made in the past 6 months had been wrong, had led him away from stability and toward this precipice where his only options were bad or worse. When would Chen Holdings need an answer? David closed his portfolio with a decisive snap that sounded like a door closing, like an opportunity ending, like time running out. "The formal proposal will be delivered within a week," he said, standing to leave but pausing at the door with what seemed like genuine advice rather than strategic positioning. "Mr. Montgomery, whoever makes decisions at Chen Holdings clearly knows your company's vulnerabilities intimately. The proposal is too specific, too targeted to be based on routine financial analysis." The implication hung in the air. Someone had been studying Montgomery Enterprises closely, waiting for the right moment to strike, planning this acquisition with the precision of someone who had personal knowledge of the company's weaknesses. After David Park left, Nathaniel sat in silence, the financial reports that had seemed so concerning an hour ago now appearing trivial compared to the existential threat facing the entire company. But what haunted him more than the business crisis was David's final comment about intimate knowledge of their vulnerabilities. It suggested this wasn't just opportunistic investing, it was something more targeted, more personal, more like revenge than business. And in the quiet of his father's office with Amber, already on her phone texting friends about the drama, Nathaniel's mind drifted back to Victoria, to the pregnancy she'd claimed, to the way she'd walked away into the rain without looking back. But that was impossible, he told himself. Victoria had been a consulting analyst at a mid-level firm, had lived modestly, had never shown any sign of hidden wealth or business acumen that would enable something like this. The connection his mind was trying to make didn't compute with the woman he'd been married to for 3 years, the woman who'd accepted his mother's criticisms without fighting back, who'd seemed so small and defeated that rainy night. Yet something nagged at the edge of his consciousness, some detail he'd overlooked, some question he'd never thought to ask about the woman he'd married and then discarded so easily. Chen Holdings. Chen, Victoria Chen, before she'd become Victoria Montgomery, before he'd asked her to take his name. The coincidence seemed too obvious to be real, too convenient to be anything other than his guilt manufacturing patterns where none existed. But Nathaniel reached for his phone anyway, his fingers searching for Victoria's contact information that he'd never deleted despite Amber's requests, finding only a disconnected number that led nowhere, as if the woman he'd married had simply ceased to exist the moment she'd walked out of his life. In 90 days, he'd know the truth. In 90 days, Chen Holdings would reveal its proposal and its ultimate ownership structure. And if Nathaniel's growing suspicion was correct, in 90 days he'd discover that the biggest mistake of his life wasn't just losing Victoria, it was never really knowing who she was in the first place. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Apex Tower had been chosen deliberately, Victoria knew, because its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Montgomery estate in the distance, a geographic power play that made the symbolism of this moment impossible to ignore. 89 days had passed since David Park had delivered the ultimatum to Nathaniel. 89 days during which Victoria had watched from a distance as the Montgomery family scrambled to find alternative financing, approached every bank and private equity firm they had connections with, and slowly realized that no one was willing to help them because word had spread, quietly, strategically, that Chen Holdings had marked this company as their acquisition target. But what made Victoria's hands shake slightly as she adjusted her tailored jacket wasn't the business transaction she was about to complete. It was the fact that in approximately 3 minutes, Nathaniel would walk through that door and see her for the first time since the rainy night he'd chosen his mother's approval over their marriage. Except now she was 4 months pregnant with a visible bump that even expensive clothing couldn't entirely hide, and she was about to become his boss. Richard Hawthorne sat to her right, his presence both support and witness to this moment of transformation, while David Park organized documents with the efficient precision of someone who'd orchestrated hostile acquisitions before, but never one quite this personal. "They're in the building," David said quietly, glancing at his phone where security had sent an alert that the Montgomery party had checked in at the lobby. Nathaniel, his mother Eleanor, and their attorney Gerald Blackston. But notably absent was Amber, Victoria noted, whether because Nathaniel had finally recognized his new wife's unsuitability for serious business, or because Amber had chosen her Instagram followers over supporting her husband through his family's darkest hour. Victoria didn't know and found she didn't particularly care. The door opened before Victoria had fully prepared herself, and suddenly Nathaniel was there, his face already showing the strain of 3 months spent fighting a losing battle, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose as if he'd lost weight from stress and forgotten to have it altered. But it was the moment his eyes found hers that Victoria felt the full impact of what she was doing. His expression cycled through confusion, recognition, shock, and something that might have been hope, before settling into a devastated comprehension that was almost painful to witness. Behind him, Eleanor Montgomery entered with the regal bearing of someone who'd never been told no in her 63 years. Her designer outfit impeccable, her confidence still intact despite the circumstances that had brought them here. But Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the documents being arranged on the table, not on the people in the room, which meant she had approximately 10 more seconds of ignorance before her world imploded. "Victoria?" Nathaniel's voice cracked on her name, the single word containing multitudes of questions he didn't know how to ask, his hand instinctively reaching toward her before he caught himself, remembering perhaps that he'd forfeited the right to touch her when he'd signed the divorce papers. "What are you? I don't understand what you're doing here." But even as he spoke, Victoria could see his mind working through the implications. connecting dots he'd been too distracted or too willful to connect over the past 3 months, his gaze dropping to her pregnant stomach and then back to her face with an expression that suggested he was reassembling everything he thought he knew about their relationship. "Ms. Chen is the principal owner of Chen Holdings," David Park said, with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask his satisfaction at delivering this revelation, his hand gesturing to Victoria with the formality of introducing royalty rather than the divorced wife these people had discarded. "She'll be signing the acquisition documents today as the majority stakeholder in what will become Montgomery Chen Enterprises, pending your acceptance of the terms we've outlined." But the hyphenated name was Victoria's one concession to sentiment, her acknowledgement that despite everything, the child she carried deserved to have both family legacies honored, even if one of those families had proven themselves spectacularly unworthy of the grace she was extending. Eleanor's head snapped up at David's words, her eyes finding Victoria for the first time, and the recognition that crossed her face was like watching someone realize they'd stepped off a cliff and gravity was just beginning to pull them down. "This is absurd," Eleanor said, her voice carrying less conviction than her words suggested, her aristocratic composure cracking just enough to show the panic beneath. Victoria Chen was a nobody, a consultant at some mediocre firm. She couldn't possibly... But she stopped mid-sentence as Richard Hawthorne slid a document across the table. This one a detailed dossier that laid out Victoria's true identity, her parents' fortune, the 15-year trust structure, and the trillion-dollar empire that had been quietly growing while Eleanor had been mocking her daughter-in-law's thrift store clothes. "My parents were Thomas and Linda Chen," Victoria said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands that she hid by clasping them on the table, her eyes meeting Eleanor's with the calm certainty of someone who no longer needed validation or approval from people who'd proven themselves incapable of seeing value in anything they couldn't immediately quantify. "They were murdered when I was 13 for their pharmaceutical fortune, which you've been indirectly benefiting from for the past 2 years through the licensing fees Montgomery Enterprises pays for the medications you distribute." The irony was almost too perfect. The Montgomery family had been enriching Victoria's trust without knowing it, had been paying the woman they'd treated as worthless for the privilege of operating in markets her family's innovations had created. Nathaniel sank into the nearest chair as if his legs could no longer support him, his face cycling through emotions too rapidly for Victoria to track them all. Shock, disbelief, understanding, regret, and finally a grief so profound it aged him visibly. "The baby," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes on her stomach with an expression that suggested he was finally, devastatingly understanding everything he'd lost. "You were telling the truth that night, and But he couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the magnitude of his failure, couldn't find words adequate to the betrayal he now understood he'd committed. "I was 10 weeks pregnant the night your mother pushed me on the stairs," Victoria said, and she watched Eleanor's face drain of color, watched the older woman's hand rise to her throat in a gesture that might have been guilt or might have been fear of legal consequences. "I protected my stomach when I fell, protected your grandchild while you laughed at my tears and told me I was never good enough for your family." But the accusation wasn't delivered with rage or vindictiveness. It was stated as simple fact, as historical record that needed to be acknowledged before anyone could move forward. "I spent 3 weeks in a hotel room trying to decide whether to tell you about the pregnancy, whether you deserved to know, whether this child deserved a father who'd only chosen them out of obligation rather than love." Eleanor opened her mouth, presumably to defend herself or deflect blame, but Victoria raised her hand in a gesture that somehow commanded silence despite her relative youth and the older woman's lifetime of social dominance. "I didn't come here for apologies," Victoria continued, her voice firmer now. channeling the power she'd been learning to wield over the past 3 months as she'd stepped fully into her identity as Victoria Chen rather than the diminished version of herself she'd performed as Victoria Montgomery. I came here because this company employs 240 people who had nothing to do with how your family treated me, because those employees deserve stability and competent management, and because my child deserves to inherit a functioning business from both sides of their family rather than the wreckage your financial mismanagement was creating. The words hung in the air like an indictment and a lifeline simultaneously, offering condemnation and salvation in the same breath, showing them that Victoria's revenge wasn't destruction, but something more complex and ultimately more devastating. She was going to save them, going to rescue the company they'd mismanaged, going to secure the legacy they'd nearly destroyed through their own incompetence and cruelty. And they were going to have to live with the knowledge that everything they had, they now held at her discretion. The terms are outlined in the documents in front of you, Richard said, taking over the business portion of this confrontation with the professional detachment of someone who'd negotiated hundreds of similar deals but understood this one's personal significance. Chen Holdings acquires 65% controlling interest, assumes all outstanding debt, and injects $20 million in operating capital. Montgomery family retains 35% equity and operational management roles, subject to board approval for major decisions. Nathaniel's attorney, Gerald Blackstone, reached for the documents with hands that trembled slightly, his professional composure barely maintained as he scanned terms that were simultaneously generous and humiliating. Generous because Victoria was offering far more favorable conditions than any third-party investor would provide. Humiliating because accepting them meant acknowledging that the woman they'd treated as worthless had been their salvation all along. "These terms are actually quite fair," Gerald admitted quietly, his voice carrying the surprise of someone who'd expected vindictive conditions and found something closer to mercy. "More than fair, honestly, given the company's financial position and the urgency of the timeline." "I don't want fair," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice sharp with the desperation of someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time, her hand slamming down on the table with enough force to make the documents jump. "I want this to not be happening. I want my son's company to remain in our family without interference from someone who—" But she stopped, apparently realizing mid-sentence that finishing that thought would only make things worse, would only highlight the prejudice and cruelty that had brought them to this moment. "Without interference from someone who—" "What, Mother?" Nathaniel asked, his voice hollow, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face, as if he was trying to memorize features he now realized he'd never really seen clearly before. "Someone who wasn't good enough for our family, someone whose parents didn't come from old money, someone who shopped at outlet malls and didn't go to the right schools." Each question was an accusation turned inward, a recognition of the shallow criteria they'd used to judge worth, a confession of blindness that had cost him everything that actually mattered. "She was always better than us, better than me, and I was too stupid to see it because I listened to you instead of trusting my own wife." The word wife landed like a blow, a reminder that Victoria wasn't just a business adversary. She'd been family, had been someone they should have protected and cherished, had carried the Montgomery grandchild even as she'd been pushed out into the rain and mocked for daring to ask for basic human dignity. "Ex-wife," Victoria corrected gently, not to be cruel, but to establish the reality of their current relationship, to make clear that whatever happened in this room was about business and legacy, not reconciliation or romantic second chances. "We're not married anymore, Nathaniel. You made that choice when you signed the divorce papers, and I made my choice when I signed the acquisition papers that brought us here today." But as Victoria spoke, she watched a tear slide down Nathaniel's face, watched him cry openly in front of his mother, and the lawyers and the trustees with the abandon of someone who'd realized too late what he'd lost and could no longer maintain the pretense of composure. "I'm so sorry," he said, the words inadequate and insufficient, but apparently all he could manage, his voice breaking on each syllable. "I was weak, and I let her manipulate me, and I chose wrong, and I don't know how to—" But he couldn't finish, couldn't articulate a path forward because there wasn't one. Not really. Not in the way he seemed to want. "You're going to sign the papers," Victoria said, her tone not unkind but completely firm, the voice of someone who'd learned that compassion didn't require accepting mistreatment or allowing people to escape consequences. "You're going to accept these terms, keep your operational role, and work to rebuild this company into something your grandfather would have been proud of instead of the declining enterprise your family's dysfunction was creating." She paused, letting the words settle, making sure he understood what she was offering and what she wasn't. "And you're going to do it knowing that every success you have from this point forward exists because I chose mercy over revenge, chose to save you rather than destroy you, chose to give our child a father with dignity rather than a broken man consumed by regret." The "our child" made Nathaniel's eyes close in visible pain, made Eleanor gasp softly as the reality of the grandchild she'd nearly caused to be lost through her cruelty fully registered, made everyone in the room confront the human cost of the decisions that had led to this moment. "Will I?" Nathaniel started, then stopped, then forced himself to continue with visible effort. "Will I be part of the baby's life? Or is that over too?" But the question revealed everything about his priorities, Victoria thought. He was asking about fatherhood rights before asking about the details of the business transaction, was putting his child above his pride in a way he should have done months ago when it might have mattered. Victoria's hand moved to her stomach in an unconscious protective gesture, and she considered the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than the dismissive cruelty Eleanor would have shown in her position. "That depends entirely on who you become," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "The man who kicked me out in the rain doesn't get access to this child. The man who let his mother push a pregnant woman on the stairs doesn't deserve fatherhood." But she saw him flinch at each accusation, saw the shame written across his features, and continued before he could spiral into self-pity. "But the man who signs these papers, who rebuilds this company, who proves he can make decisions based on integrity rather than his mother's approval, that man might earn the privilege of knowing his child, not as a right but as something you'd have to prove yourself worthy of over time." It was more than he deserved, Victoria knew, more grace than he'd shown her, but it was also what the child growing inside her deserved, a chance, however slim, to have a father who'd learned from his catastrophic mistakes and become someone better. "I'll sign," Nathaniel said immediately, reaching for the pen with hands that shook but remained steady enough to write, his eyes on Victoria's face as if her expression held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Whatever terms you want, whatever conditions you set, I'll sign everything, and I'll spend however long it takes proving I can be the person my child deserves." But before Nathaniel could actually sign, Eleanor's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, her grip tight enough to stop the pen's movement, her face a mask of aristocratic outrage that couldn't quite hide the desperation beneath. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her voice low and venomous in a way that revealed the ugliness Victoria had always known existed beneath Eleanor's polished surface. "We'll find other financing, we'll sell assets, we'll do whatever it takes to avoid giving this woman control over our family legacy." But the problem with Eleanor's defiance was that it came 3 months too late. There were no other options, no miraculous solutions waiting in the wings. No escape routes from the consequences of her own cruelty and financial incompetence. "Let go of his hand," Victoria said quietly, but with enough steel in her voice that Eleanor's grip loosened reflexively. before her conscious mind could override the instinct to obey authority. You've controlled Nathaniel's decisions for 34 years, Eleanor. You've told him who to marry, how to run his company, what to value and what to discard, and every single one of those decisions you influenced has led him here to this moment, signing away majority control of the family business to the woman you called worthless. But Victoria leaned forward, her eyes locked on Eleanor's with an intensity that made the older woman actually lean back in her chair. I'm not taking your family legacy, Eleanor. I'm saving it from you. There's a difference. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Nathaniel's pen scratching across paper as he signed document after document, transferring power from his family to Victoria's, with each signature that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Eleanor watched with an expression that cycled through rage, grief, and finally a bitter resignation that suggested she understood, perhaps for the first time, that her actions had consequences she couldn't talk her way out of or socially manipulate away. But when all the papers had been signed, when the Montgomery-Chen Enterprises merger was legally binding and irrevocable, Nathaniel didn't stand to leave. He sat there, staring at Victoria with tears streaming down his face, crying with the kind of complete devastation that comes from recognizing you've destroyed the best thing in your life through your own weakness and will spend the rest of your days living with that knowledge. I loved you, he said finally, the words simple and raw and completely inadequate to the moment. I know I didn't show it. I know I let her convince me you weren't enough, but I did love you, Victoria. I do love you. But the confession was too late and too compromised by all the ways he'd demonstrated the opposite, too tainted by the question of whether he loved her or simply loved what he now knew she represented, the power, the wealth, the status he'd discarded without recognizing its value. Victoria stood, gathering her copies of the signed documents with the careful precision of someone maintaining composure, through force of will, and she looked at Nathaniel with an expression that held both pity and finality. Love isn't just a feeling, Nathaniel, she said gently. It's action, it's choices, it's standing beside someone when your mother laughs at them in the rain. You may have felt something you called love, but you didn't love me enough to protect me, to choose me, to even believe me when I told you I was carrying your child. She paused at the door, one hand on her stomach, the other on the handle. Maybe you'll learn to love better. For our child's sake, I hope you do. But that love, if it develops, will be something you build through actions rather than words, through consistency rather than crisis declarations. As Victoria walked out of the conference room with Richard and David following, leaving Nathaniel crying at the table while his mother sat in stunned silence, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not triumph exactly, not satisfaction in the way she'd imagined, but a quiet sense of closure that came from facing the people who'd hurt her and emerging with both her dignity and her power intact. The child inside her shifted, a small flutter that was becoming more frequent, and Victoria thought about the future she was building. One where her son or daughter would know their worth from the beginning, would never have to hide their identity to feel safe, would be raised by a mother who'd learned that you could be both kind and powerful, both forgiving and firm. Behind her, through the closing elevator doors, she caught one last glimpse of Nathaniel's devastated face, and she thought, this is what regret looks like when it comes too late to change anything. But she also thought, this is what justice looks like when it wears mercy like armor. And as the elevator descended toward a future Victoria would shape entirely on her own terms, she realized that the child growing inside her would inherit both the Montgomery legacy and the Chen Empire, but more importantly, they would inherit the lesson that had cost their father everything to learn, that you judge people by their character, not their circumstances, and that underestimating someone because they seem small is the fastest way to discover just how powerful they've always been.